Reading 58 from the Psychological Commentaries on the Teaching of Gurdjieff and Ouspensky by Maurice Nicoll, Volume 2. Birdlet, February 3rd, 1945. The Doctrine of Eyes. 2. Recently, we have been talking about the doctrine of different eyes in us, and how, unless we can see we consist of many eyes, we cannot shift from where we are. Before we go on, let us remind ourselves how different eyes arise in us and what the work teaches on this subject. The work teaches that we are born with essence alone, and in small children, we have manifestations of undeveloped essence. Essence comes down to this level of the earth in order to grow, but it cannot grow by itself beyond a very small point. Notice, by the way, that small children do not have negative emotions, which are defined by their persistence. A child grows up among sleeping people and begins to form personality, which gradually surrounds essence. A small child never says I. When it begins to say I, imaginary I begins. Many eyes are laid down by imitation, etc., and the growing child begins to say I to all of them. I suppose it could be said it begins to say I by a kind of imitation, by a kind of imagining itself I, and it hears adults always saying I. However, many other interesting things enter. Now we speak of ourselves as adults. We have inevitably, and even by design, acquired a wrong feeling of I, that is, imaginary I. If essence is going to grow in us further, everything connected with imaginary I must become passive. Therefore, it is understandable that the work says that unless a man can divide himself into two, he cannot shift from his psychological state. Dividing yourself into two means to divide yourself into an observing side and an observed side. Unless a man can observe himself, he cannot change. Such a person will remain always the same man, the same woman. Also, you all know that as long as a person takes himself or herself as one person, as always being the same I, he or she cannot change. Recently, there was a conversation about lying. The work has many things to say about lying. For example, the deepest thing the work says about lying is that it destroys essence. A person who always lies destroys his or her essence. Now, essence is the only part in us that can grow and bring us to another level of being, and so to another fate, to another position in the scale of being. A liar cannot grow. Everyone has in them a great number of eyes that lie, and these eyes are always connected with the tremendous activity of self-justifying eyes. A person should be uncomfortable when he or she lies. The work says there are two forms of lying, that is, lying to others and lying to oneself. At the same time, the work says that lying can only be defined by a relationship to some system of truth. If you have never been taught anything about what truth is, it is difficult to see how you can lie. A small child who knows nothing does not lie and cannot lie, but when he is taught something, he may begin to lie in regard to what he has been taught. You can only lie in connection with some truth. If you have never been taught any ideas of right and wrong about truth and falsity, how exactly can you lie? As soon as a man was capable of conceiving the idea of things forbidden and things allowed, he gained the capacity of lying. Now, you can lie in this work, and lying in this work destroys your possibilities of development. You can both lie to other people and lie to yourself. And I would say the center of gravity of the work teaching, in this respect, regards lying to yourself as the most important thing. But the work begins by saying you must not lie to your teacher. You may not wish to speak to your teacher about something, but if you are asked to tell what happened and you lie, and this is always known, then you are in a dangerous position, not only towards the work, but towards your inner possibilities of development. Now, the system of the work is a quite clearly defined thing, and you can all know quite well what it means to lie to the work. You may lie in life, but to lie to the work is quite a different thing. You are then lying in reference to a definite system of truth. You realize that any development of the psychic life is only possible through a system of truth taught you, which you begin to follow. You have to begin to live this work, not merely to think of it or talk about it. The work is a definite system of teaching, of forms of truth, that if you begin to live them practically, will lead you in a certain very desirable direction. This living of the truth of the work means work on yourself. It means that you want to follow what the work teaches. But if you lie to yourself internally, as when you say you are not negative and you are, then you block the influences of the work in yourself. All development depends, in the esoteric sense, on relating yourself to a system of teaching which does not lie in life. The work is something extra. It is the second education. A man may be a naturally good fellow in life, but this is not the idea of the work, because the idea of the work and of all esotericism, including the Gospels, is to bring you face to face with an entirely different way of living in life. And it is only through this entirely different way of living and of understanding that the aim of esoteric teaching on this earth is fulfilled. For example, through social training, you may not express negative emotions publicly by reason of your training, but this has nothing to do with the work. You have to get an entirely different relationship to the whole idea of negative emotions, and one that is not governed by external experiences. Internally, people who have learnt not to express their negative emotions in life may be infested with negative emotions. For this reason, it is so important not to lie to oneself. On one occasion, O said, "Lying destroys essence because essence can only grow through truth. A man must cease to deceive himself before he can begin to grow. The worst form of lying is pretense. Everyone pretends to be what he is not. The source of all lying of this kind lies in the imagination." End quote. On another occasion, he was talking about life in general and said, "Nothing in life is what it pretends to be." At that time, he was talking about the League of Nations. He said, "It is not what it pretends to be, just as so many other apparently excellent organizations are not what they pretend to be. How can you expect sleeping people to create organizations far beyond their own level of being?" End quote. I was very much struck by this, as I thought sweeping statement about charitable organizations, etc. in life. On one occasion, we were passing a church with people coming out, and he said the same thing, namely to the effect that a church does not do what it pretends to do, to make people like Christ. And I was reminded of what G once said about Christianity, that there was only one Christian called Christ. Now, let us take lying on a practical level, and let us take in particular that form of lying that begins with imaginary I and becomes connected with false personality. We are told in the work parable that the human race on earth are like sheep under the charge of 2 farmers, who are magicians, and whose object is to prevent the sheep from escaping from their power, and that, being very mean, not wishing to use any expensive methods of retaining the sheep, they hypnotized the sheep and told them they were lions and eagles, and in fact, supermen. This is a parable about the power of imagination, connected with imaginary I, which eventually creates the false personality. The false personality is entirely pretense, entirely imagination, and its origin is from the imaginary I. That is, the imagination that we have a real I in us. With this form of imagination, which keeps us as sheep asleep, we gain the most extraordinary ideas about ourselves. We think we can do, for example. We think we have real will. We think we can decide our own lives, and we can never see that everything happens, even our own lives. We form in ourselves a kind of secret imagination, and although life itself does not correspond to this secret imagination, we still cling to it, feeling we are lions, eagles, supermen, etc., and never realize what we actually are like. The imagination that we have the imagination that we are doing everything from ourselves, the inability to see that we are mechanical and that everything happens to us, the non-realization of this imaginary I and all the fantasies that it builds up in the false personality, and this inability to see where we really are, this inability to see what our lives have been, all this keeps us fast asleep in a continual self-lying, a continual pretense, a continual self-hypnotism. This state of ourselves is described in another work parable as a driver sitting in a public house and spending all his money on drink, while his horse and carriage in which he can go somewhere real are standing outside neglected. You remember that this parable says the first step is to awaken the driver. What is this drink that the driver is drinking? It is imagination about himself, and we only have ourselves to drink, literally to see the strength of this imagination. What does everybody begin to do when they begin to drink, literally? They begin to boast, or they begin to reveal their secret self-imagination, how wonderful they really are, and how no one has appreciated them, and so on, because everyone has this secret self-romance connected with imaginary I and false personality. And this constitutes one of the most hidden sources of making internal accounts. The first form of lying we have to study in ourselves, the work says, is that in which we always tend to tell about something that happened to ourselves to our own advantage. When you have to report what you said and what the other person said in some work conversation, you will find that it is practically impossible to put the matter rightly. You will tend to put the whole report to your own advantage by leaving out some things you said and slightly overemphasizing other things you said. Of course, you can do the same thing the other way round by deliberately putting yourself in a very bad light through wretched self-pity, which hopes for a reward. However, people are quite certain they can speak the unbiased truth both about themselves and other people. Certainly, there are more truthful eyes in us and less truthful eyes. But what is the whole object of this being truthful in the work? It is not based on moral grounds. It is based on the possible development of something called essence that can never grow through pretense or falsity. All those eyes that lie habitually, all those eyes that protect the central kingdom of the false personality and justify everything, twist everything, turn everything to their own advantage, prevent this inner development of essence from taking place. For this reason, the work teaches, It is so important to tell the truth to your teacher, because by this exercise you learn how to tell the truth to yourself. And if you cannot tell the truth to yourself, you cannot get beyond the sphere of the imaginary I and the false personality, which cannot give you any inner development. So it is not a moral question, but a practical one. If we begin to see more now the falsities in our past lives, we begin to alter them in the past. We can see lies in the past, but we only see them through work on ourselves in the present. If our observation of ourselves has become increased now, in the present, and we begin to see all sorts of false attitudes, false intonations, false ways of conceiving of our own value, false blaming, etc., we are mercifully able to see the same things having operated in the past. That is, we change the past from the present moment of work, because life is a compact thing lying coiled up in ourselves, and when we die, we take this coiled up thing with us. Sometimes I have thought we can change the past more easily than the future. This is partly because when you begin to awaken a little more to what you are like, the past comes forward and enters your consciousness, whereas the unknown future does not come forward in the same way. Always in the future lie further temptations, but you are not tempted by the past in the same way, except by habit. It is marvelous how the work opens up your past in exactly the right way when you have begun to lift yourself in the present moment to the level of the work. Now you begin to see what your lying has been in the past, and you begin to understand that what is called lying in the work is not always what you thought. It may not be expressed by lying in words. Call it, if you like, pretending. A person can lie with a single gesture, a single look, a single intonation, a casual mannerism, a sigh, a heartbroken expression, an illness, by a hearty manner, by being always fit and well. We all know how marvelously we have behaved, and we all know what intolerable conditions we have been subjected to. The work says we all lead an imaginary life with ourselves. Now, this romance may take a great deal of strength from us, and in all cases it prevents us from any real self-observation. It has to be torn out of the heart. The self-emotions are tremendously powerful. Sometimes these self-romances clustered round the imaginary I are sad and tragic. We all know one another's hopeless looks. When we are based on this inner self-romance, we are very weak. Whether the self-romance is about being strong and cheerful, or being misunderstood, or never having had a chance, etc. It is all self-hypnotism, and it is always a deep source of our making of internal accounts, because we do not see this form of imagination which has such invisible power over us. We do not see the eyes that use this form of imagination that gives us a false center of gravity and makes us completely misunderstood. And makes us completely misunderstand the significance of our lives and what has happened in our lives. It prevents us seeing our lives as they are and asking ourselves this rather terrible question: why has your life been like this? After a time, we may begin to get a work conscience. This makes us very unhappy, not in a soul-destroying way of self-pity and pseudo-suffering, but in a much cleaner way. This is the beginning of that force that can make you see your own lying. It is not an acquired life conscience from your upbringing, but the beginning of real conscience which can change one's life. It is the birth in you of something quite new, and though its action is very gentle, it is absolutely authentic, and you know and you recognize its authority. This is the beginning of awakening from sleep. This conscience knows nothing about your being an Englishman or a Chinese or a rich or a poor man. It is the same in everybody once it is awakened. It is nothing to do with customs you have acquired, the schools you went to, the professions you follow, or the social position you hold. For it, you do not exist as a personality. The work teaches that this real conscience, which is always the same, lies buried in everyone, and that the work awakens it eventually. This conscience serves the work. It leads to contact with higher centers. This conscience can never awaken as long as imaginary I and false personality and all the forms of lying connected with them are dominant, because this conscience leads in the direction of real I, which is totally above the level of imaginary I and false personality and all their pretenses. Remember also lying that harms others in the work. This is too big a subject for here, but remember how you treat another in your mind.